In this case, we're going to be looking at Chapter 12, and we're going to be focusing specifically on a chi-squared test and a chi-squared estimation, also called a confidence interval, a chi-squared test and a chi-squared estimation of the population variance. So let me read through this and I'll show you how I've come to that conclusion. So it says, refrigerator manufacturers design their units to maintain temperatures within a certain range. Too much temperature variation, already they've mentioned variation. Too much temperature variation can result in food freezing or spoiling prematurely. Too little temperature variation can lead to higher energy costs because the refrigerator's compressor cycles on and off more often than necessary. So basically, we don't want to see too much variation. We don't want to see too little variation. So the idea is going to be that we're trying to keep the variation, or we're trying to make sure that the variation is sitting right around the proper number, not too big, not too small. Okay, so let's see what else they say here. It says, suppose LG, a major refrigerator manufacturer, has been trying to achieve a variance equal to 2.25 degrees Celsius for a particular model. Okay, so that's what we're shooting for. Like I said before, we don't want it to be too much, we don't want it to be too little. Apparently, it is best when the variance, not just in general the variation, but very specifically the variance, because it could have been a question about standard deviation, but it's not. It's a question about variance. They want the variance to sit at 2.25 degrees Celsius. So they then say, to test for this variation under normal operating conditions, the refrigerator was filled to 75% capacity with food and was opened 30 times during an 8-hour day for 10 seconds duration. The data file, or the data in the Excel file name refrigerator.xls, contained the reading in degrees Celsius that were recorded during this experiment. Okay, so just in case you're a little confused by this, you really don't need to pay any attention to the fact that it was 75% capacity. That doesn't make any difference to us. Also, it doesn't matter that it's an 8-hour day, and it doesn't matter for our questions here that it's open for 10 seconds duration. Really, all that we're interested in is the fact that the door was open 30 times, because what that did was that gave us 30 observations. And so we would say that we have a sample size equals to n, and that is 30. Okay, so let's have a look and see what they actually ask us in Part A and Part B. In Part A it says, using the data in the Excel file, given alpha is 5%. Now, alpha is something that they typically mention for hypothesis tests, but we can't rely just on this alone to tell us that it's a hypothesis test, but it does make it seem like that's the direction we're heading in. Using the data in the Excel file, given alpha is 5%, LG would like to perform a hypothesis test. Okay, well that's pretty clear, so we know that we're doing a hypothesis test. To determine if the variance of the temperature, so it's a hypothesis test of the variance, of the temperature for this particular model is 2.25 degrees Celsius. Perform the test and provide your conclusions. Okay, so there is a test in Chapter 12. It's a chi-squared test, as I mentioned before, that is a chi-squared test of the variance. It's the population variance that we're working on here. You're never going to perform a hypothesis test, and you're never going to perform a confidence interval of sample information. You would never test the sample variance. You would never do an estimation of the sample variance, basically because the sample variance is something that we can actually see. We have access to the sample data, so we don't need to hypothesize about its value. It's something that we can actually measure or calculate. Whereas the population variance, we can't do that. We don't have access to the data in the population, so all that we can do with population variances or population means or anything like that, unless they give them to us directly, we just have to infer. We have to do a hypothesis test, or we have to do an estimation. So that's what we're doing in Part A. We're going to try and figure out whether or not, as they've suggested, it's equals to 2.25. So that's our job in Part A. Now in Part B they say LG would also like to include in their analysis a a 90% estimate for the variance of the temperatures. Provide the 90% confidence interval. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, estimate is really the same thing as confidence interval. Those two terms are synonymous. So they're asking for a 90% estimation, a 90% confidence interval. It's the same thing, so we just have one job to do in Part B. And Part B is sort of a slightly different version of Part A. In Part B, they're asking us to come up with what we think the value is. Now, in Part A, they give us a suggested value of 2.25, and they want to know, does the sample data agree with the 2.25? In Part B, we're not comparing it to any kind of a suggested value. We're just being asked to come up with a number ourselves. And it's not simply going to be an answer like we believe that it's equals to 2. Instead, it's going to end up being a range. It would be more like if I asked you, how old do you estimate a certain person is, and you say that I believe that they are between 18 and 22. This is what an estimation looks like. It gives you a lower limit, and it gives you an upper limit. And there's also a certain amount of confidence that the value does fall somewhere in there. In our case, we're going to be working with 90% confidence. So in Part B, we're going to be doing a confidence interval estimate. Part A, we're doing a hypothesis test. And so this is a fairly straightforward question. And once again, it's Chapter 12 that provides the tools for this. And Chapter 12 gives us the chi-squared test and estimate to perform Part A and Part B with.